Uh, Thank you, Neil. That actually sets up quite well for what I would like to talk about today from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's perspective. So my name is Ashley Farley. I'm a Program Officer of Knowledge and Research Services. I've been at the foundation for about 6 years now, and my career has been in libraries, so really focused on information to access, or access to information, sorry, and improving kind of knowledge as a whole. So while I've been mainly focused on our open access policy, there's an underlying data component to that. And then also along the journey of making that stronger, we've really kicked off kind of this foundation enterprise-wide look at how we manage data sharing, what our requirements are, what our supports are. So it's been quite a massive endeavor over the last 2 years to really kind of evaluate where we are. And I'm excited to share kind of what we've learned along the way. I hope not to focus too much on kind of the pain points or gaps, because I think we discuss that a lot, and hope to transition more into sort of our thinking and some of the things that we're piloting and hoping will help ease those pain points. So at a very high level, some of the things that we've learned have been kind of capacity and resourcing limitations, which have already been touched on. That's a major barrier. Something that I think was a little interesting that we learned through some of our kind of compliance checking of the underlying data, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, is the dependence of success of data sharing is to kind of the resources available, not even from a funding perspective, but more of a research ecosystem, like where they publish, what institution are they at, what resources are they able to easily plug into and have supports for, really made a difference in kind of compliance and data sharing and removing those barriers. And then some thoughts around downstream versus upstream, which has been really important for the work that I've been doing, because we are looking at data sets underlying open access publications, but that's often after the grant is closed. Researchers are trying to wrap up this portion of the project to move on to the next. And it's a really hectic time to try and expect data sharing and having the data sharing be successful if there wasn't the considerations built in, I think, more upstream. So the Gates Foundations, we have 5 major divisions. I'm in global health, and so, but the policy spans the entire foundation. We also have, a robust education team. We have offices globally. So we focus on a lot of different disciplines in global health, global development, education. But we realized as we started to map out what the friction points were, they kind of fell into this similar buckets. And but definitely want to highlight that while different disciplines may be experiencing the same obstacles to data sharing, the solutions might not necessarily be one size fit all, but we do think there's some basic scalability across the board to help remove some of these friction points, especially from how we use data use agreements from a legal perspective, kind of how we work politically and use our voice both internally and externally, and definitely I think the technical as well. So building that infrastructure to make it easier, and also the bucket about the resources and kind of the finances behind being able to share data more easily. So this has been some of the what we're kind of looking at to be able to fix throughout our pilots and policy changes. This is a really kind of interesting study that I did a couple years ago. So I wanted to see what our underlying data compliance was. And I don't think it'll be shocking to hear that it wasn't great. But what was interesting is to try to get a handle on what does this data look like in association to these open access publications? Where are the gaps? And how could we then kind of come up with a better plan to make this a much more successful? So some of the things that I noticed kind of right off the bat was where grantees published is really dependent on the supports that they had there or the requirements of the publishers to make data openly available. So a lot of the fully open access journals that are really living the values of open science and data sharing, worked really hard with the authors to be able to make that happen, making sure linkages were happen in ways that we didn't see in some other publishers that maybe didn't even require data availability statements as a norm, or look at those, or accept statements of, contact the authors for data access, which is something that is not compliant with our policy. So it was interesting to take a look at this and seeing, what was kind of a good threshold of data sharing. Of course, we took into consideration any sort of legal issues or ethical concerns that we may not have been able to account for early on in the research, or they just can't be shared, and that's definitely understandable. So we're trying to be flexible in some cases and learn from those, and then to be able to be better prepared in the future to make sure that we could help share the data as much as possible through other means that have been, I think, discussed in previous conversations. So that was a good lesson for us, and so kind of starting with the scope of underlying data for open access publications, what can we learn from there, and scaling that up to kind of enterprise data, or data that may not be associated with a publication but still valuable to the research community. I wanted to share this bit of recent. I put the link in. I guess you can't see it, but it's a recent Wellcome Trust blog post around data sharing in the time of COVID, which I think is definitely well worth a read. And I think there'll be further research on this topic coming out as we continue on along our COVID journey, and seeing kind of what data is coming out of it. I think when we were early on in the pandemic, one of the silver linings for me is it really showed the importance of data sharing and openness as much as possible. We were able to actually be pretty progressive with data use agreements in ways that we've been discussing for a long time, but haven't been able to quite deploy. So now we're kind of at the stage of seeing how that data is being managed and shared and coming out of these grants. And we've formed some new partnerships with resources like Vivly to help our grantees be able to actually live the data agreements in their grant agreements. So basically, some of this too, so data availability statements is something that I'm really focusing on to help improve the underlying data to the open access policy. Because I think in the past 5 years that we've had this policy, where we don't know what we don't know, or we can't know what we don't know. We don't really know what's missing. We don't track data outputs in our grant database, which I think is something that we're also working on developing in the future, to be able to see what are these outputs. And then I've realized just in the early work that we've already done in requiring data availability statements for all manuscripts, whether it's something that the publisher themselves require, is it actually really encourages thinking about the data sharing component. And while it still is pretty downstream in the process, it's led us to have great conversations with grantees of okay, so here's where we missed this ground. Next time when we have a project or grant, we are going to, I think, be more intentional about the data sharing aspect of it. And it also helps create necessary linkages. So here's an example that we have on Gates Open Research, which is built on F1000 technology. It's our fully open post-publication peer-reviewed platform. It's what I really see as the future of knowledge dissemination. And so here's a pretty robust data availability statement. And this is kind of the structure that we're using. I mean, this example is the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. So they do have a lot of resources to make this data available. So definitely understanding that. But I think it gives a good example of the linkages to the data, what the data file types look like, commenting on one where there are ethical considerations, and just kind of spelling out how other researchers can know where the data was generated and potentially get more of a managed access to it. And then also kind of extended data and the links to repositories. So trying to really encourage repository use and links back. So yeah, focusing on, explicitly stating why some data can't be openly shared, I think is really important, and then necessary ways to gain access to safeguarded data. And I wanted to show one successful example that I think is really cool. I recently learned about one of our grantees. So this is Michigan State University, and so they have University at Michigan, sorry. Deep Blue Data is their repository, and it's they actually have depositing assistance for our grantees. So this is an example of a data deposit that is something that we funded. There's robust metadata, and there's also the external linkages, which I think is really cool. So if you look at this snapshot, we see the articles that use this data, but if you actually went to the articles themselves, they wouldn't then link back to this data repository, probably because of many reasons, or the publications came out soon, but before the deposit was made in the repository. But I'm excited to see some of these linkages come out, because this will help me be able to better understand where the data is flowing in a way that we haven't before. So yeah, this is, I think, a great example of making those connections with resources that grantees may have that aren't necessarily directed to the funding source, and making that data stronger. I want to make sure I stick to time. So what is the big kind of what we're thinking is ensuring that enterprise-wide we get to a point where we're treating data as an asset. And this is kind of a working guideline for us of where we're headed, and the difference between kind of enterprise and then also that more program specific. So understanding that what works for some program teams won't work the same for others, but at a very high level, we're starting with kind of principles, setting policies and voice. So not, policies usually equate to mandate, but as far as using our voice internally and externally, and then setting principles and intentionally following those as we have conversations with grantees, I think is a great motivator for data sharing. And then we're also thinking about the enterprise processes and systems. So how do we make it easier through our legal agreements? We are working on thinking of data systems to make that more efficient, so that it isn't a cost or time burden of our grantees. And then, similar to what Neil had just mentioned, guidance and support not only for the grantees, but our program staff. I think when we first launched our open access policy and the underlying data component, we're like, yeah, everyone, these are experts in the field and know exactly how to bundle up the data and share it, and then everyone will use it and it'll be easy and great. And that's just not the reality of it. But I do think we can get closer to there. So how can we do better? This is what I would like to leave you with is, I think starting something pretty simple but strong as data availability statements as a requirement to all publications, partnering with publishers and partners who do this well. So I really want to, highlight and encourage through our communications with grantees, as well as even maybe our grant agreements, of making sure that they know what is available to them and how to tap into it, so that there isn't a gap there. Of course, recognizing and promoting those that are already doing this. And then I think showing the value of data management and sharing will encourage these practices without a forcing mechanism, so that it doesn't always have to seem like we are giving things away, but being a part of the community and being able to use things as well to strengthen your own research, I think is messaging that we should be continually improving. So as Neil said, we've definitely, I think, gotten away from the conversation around theft, but I think we can even make it stronger by, talking more about what we can get out of it as well as when we share, and then treating data as an asset. Thank you.